Texas. When we first moved to Denver in 1977, they would say to us things like, "How are you guys doing?" And we'd go, "You guys?" That was foreign to us because we were used to hearing, "How are y'all doing?" So, how are y'all doing? So we have to learn that before you leave today. A little about me. I also grew up in Houston, Texas, and I was raised in a Catholic church. And so I had a lot of head knowledge about Jesus and about God and the Bible stories, but I didn't have a lot of heart knowledge. Well, somewhere along the line in my late 20s, and we had been married several years, we had 3 small children, beautiful children, but I realized that in my life something was missing because I was very unhappy. I felt like there was no purpose to my life. I felt like life was just a dead end. And so, fortunately, there were people in my life who were brave enough to witness to me. One of them was my brother. And so, fortunately, several months later, I did say that prayer of salvation. And I think I was 29 when I walked that aisle and I accepted Christ. And from that moment, my life totally changed for the better. I knew then that the Lord did have a purpose for me, and I think that as nervous as I am now, speaking to you, that this was part of his purpose, that we would be allowed and be able to come and share this with you. I will tell you that Colorado is our second favorite state in the Union, the first being the Lone Star State of Texas, where we're from, the second being Colorado, because we lived here and grew to love the people, the mountains, and everything that has to do with Colorado. You're very fortunate to live in such a beautiful area, and we are so very thankful that you came here tonight to hear us speak to you. I'm going to follow up on what David said about tragedy and suffering, because if anyone in here has not suffered, if you would raise your hand. If you had raised your hand, you would be the only one in the world who has never gone through any suffering. Your children maybe have never suffered. Your parents have never suffered. And we have experienced suffering with our parents, with our children, who didn't always make the best decisions. And our children are 36, 34, and 32. And they have, as we have, made many mistakes in their lives. But through those mistakes, thank God, they have become stronger people and stronger Christians. So, can God really bring good out of evil? He can. And I think we're on. Yes, thank you, David. If God is truly all-wise, then he knows the present, but he knows the future. If God truly is love, then how could he allow these awful things to happen? And the answer is that God foresees that in the long run, we will be better off working through those struggles than if he miraculously intervenes and prevents those tragedies from happening. He already knows that. He knows what we're going to do, the choices we're going to make. And I want to talk about some examples. And I'll take 2 examples from the Bible. And I think we're still on slide 7, so you're still good back there. We're going to talk a little bit about Joseph, if you remember him. And the story of Joseph really fascinates me because Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. So he had 10 older brothers. Can you imagine being the youngest of 11 kids? And Jacob doted on Joseph. He loved him so much that he gave him a highly decorated coat that his brothers did not get. Joseph and Jacob were so close that when Joseph would go home from the fields, he would talk to his dad and he would tell him the naughty things and the not good things that his brothers were doing. So he would go and tattle on them, and probably not maliciously, but because he was so close with his dad. Well, Joseph was about 17 years old when the brothers decided they had had enough of that. And so they began to plot to murder Joseph. Well, Reuben was the oldest brother, and Reuben said, "No, we are not going to murder Joseph, but we're going to sell him." And so they did. And so if you know the rest of that story, he was sold, and then he was sold again to Potiphar, and then he got into some trouble when he went to Egypt because Potiphar's wife took a liking to him. He went to prison for a while, But then he interpreted a dream for Potiphar about 7 years of bountiful harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. And back before the brothers sold Joseph, he had a dream at the house that he shared with his brothers where his family would be bowing down to Joseph. Well, the brothers didn't go for that. They determined they were never going to bow down to their brother. Eventually, Joseph was made the ruler of Egypt, second only to Potiphar. And so when those years of famine came, the 10 brothers were sent to Egypt to buy grain for their family, and guess who they had to go talk to? Well, they had to go talk to little brother Joseph. They didn't recognize him, but he recognized his 10 brothers, and they reconciled, and the family came to live in Egypt with Joseph. So in Genesis 50:20, it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." And that took years to accomplish that story. But the good that came out of it was that Joseph's family was reunited in the end. We'll take one other example of David, because David is probably one of my favorite. And look, there's 2 Davids, one I married and one that's taking care of all right, that's a good sign. David was such an interesting person to me because throughout his whole life, he accomplished a lot of good, but he also made a lot of bad decisions. At a young age, he was anointed by the prophet Samuel to be next in line of king to Saul. Well, he also slew Goliath, the giant, for the Philistines. He eventually replaces King Saul as the king. He built a temple to house the ark, but then he made a mistake. You remember the story of Bathsheba? Well, they had a baby. That baby did not live. They had a second baby. That baby was Solomon. And while all of that was going on, David plotted to have Uriah go back out to war because he felt so guilty about that occurring. And so eventually, Uriah was killed while he was in battle. David's children had problems. Can you relate to that? We can. His one son, Ammon, raped the half-sister Tamar, if you remember that story. His son, Adonijah, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, led a coup against David to take over the throne. And then Bathsheba forms an alliance to replace Adonijah because she wanted Solomon to be the king. Now, talk about a soap opera. If you think the Bible is not interesting, it is when you study what happened back in those days. But then we know that ultimately the good that came out of David's life, the king that he was, the Psalms that he wrote, and the man after God's own heart. I want to give you 2 earthly examples of how good came out of tragedy. Many of you may remember 9/11, and when you say the words, we might be on the next one. Thank you very much. I want to talk about on 9/11, just to give you, just in case, it's been a while since you looked at it, there were 4 coordinated terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda, in the U.S., on the U.S. That they killed almost 3,000 people, injured over 6,000. They sent 4 planes. 2 planes were going to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. 1 was going to the Pentagon. The 4th one, they think, was going to Washington, D.C., but that plane crashed, and so they weren't certain 100% that plane was going to Washington, D.C. So all of the airspace over the United States was dead. Nobody was going to be able to fly over the United States until they could figure out what was going on. Well, there was a plane, Delta Flight number 15, was diverted to a town named Gander in Newfoundland. There ended up being a total of 53 planes that were directed to this small town that had inhabitants. I think there were 10,400 people who lived in that town, and there were 10,500 people who were there who couldn't go anywhere until the U.S. released them to come home. So this deals with one flight, Delta Flight number 15. There were 218 passengers. The passengers on the plane could not talk by cell phone because the towers were jammed or they were busy. You could not get a signal. You could not talk to anybody. So nobody knew their welfare. and they did not know how their family was doing. But Gander and the surrounding communities closed their high schools, they closed their meeting halls, they closed all of their large gathering places, and they converted all of these areas to lodging for all of those passengers who could not get back to the United States. And then they put their high school students to work. Instead of going to class, the students were to take care of all the passengers. So they helped feed them, they helped make sure that every single need was met. The passengers during those 2 days that they were in Gander were offered trips to the surrounding communities. They were offered boat cruises. They were offered hikes, anything they could to pass the time while they were there. The bakeries and the restaurants stayed open to make fresh food for them throughout the time they were there. So at the end of about 2 days, when they were allowed to get back on their plane and come home, that plane, the people on that plane decided that they wanted to do something for the community of Gander. So they took up a collection, and they found a trust fund that provided college scholarships to those high school seniors that had helped them. And there were lasting relationships that happened because of an evil that was perpetuated by another country on the United States, and this happened in yet another foreign country. That's just only one of many, many stories that came out of 9/11 that were positive. I don't know how many of you might remember back in the 70s we had a president called Richard Nixon. He was the one president who resigned, and we were in college at the time, so it's a very vivid memory for us because we were becoming aware of the whole political situation. Well, Richard Nixon had a hatchet man, the man who did all of his naughty work, and that man was Charles Colson. He was the special counsel to President Nixon from 1969 to 1973. And during that period of time, you might remember a scandal called Watergate. Well, Watergate's an office building in Washington, D.C., and at that time, the Democratic National Committee and Convention had all their offices there and all their paperwork. Well, it was broken into and eventually traced back to President Nixon, which is one of the reasons why he resigned. And Charles Colson, or Chuck Colson, is one of the people who was implicated in that scandal, and Charles Colson served 7 months of a 3-year sentence because of that. Well, right about that same time, right before he went to prison, Charles Colson became a born-again Christian. And in those 7 months that he spent in prison, when he looked at the deplorable conditions of prison life, that he determined that he was going to do something about that when he got out of prison, and so he did. And one of the first things that he did was to found the Prison Fellowship Ministries, which mobilized the Christian church across the world to intervene and to minister to prisoners. And in fact, David's brother and my brother both work with inmates at prisons because they live very close, within 30, 40 minutes of the prison system. And so they work with them even to this day. Charles Colson also founded the Justice Fellowship in 1983, and that implemented criminal justice reform. In 1991, he launched what he called a Breakpoint, and it was a radio commentary that provided a Christian perspective on today's news. Because if you listen to the news, is it positive? No. Is it slanted? Yes. Is it what we want to hear? No. Is it what the truth? No. It's a perception of somebody's truth. But he founded Breakpoint to give Christians an objective radio station to listen to, objective people to listen to. And in 2009, Colson was a writer of the Manhattan Declaration, and that calls for Christians to defend the sanctity of human life, to defend traditional marriage, and to defend religious freedom. He died in 2012, but not before he had written 30 books that pushed forward the cause of Christianity and what we should be doing as strong Christians. I want to give one personal example of how good comes out of evil. In 2003, our youngest son, Benjamin, was 19 years old, and he had come home from college in May, and he had met up with two of his friends, Tony and Andrew, and they went to play basketball one night at 9 o'clock at night. And now at 9 o'clock, we're going to bed, they're going out. That's a teenager. And so about midnight, they're starting to come home, and Andrew and Ben get in one car, and Tony gets in his car. And I don't know if you know people who do this, but they start playing chicken. One speeds up and gets in front of one, and then the other one speeds up and gets in front. And so they do this speeding down. Now, we don't know this until after the fact, but they're speeding down this long road. And then towards the end of the road, when they knew they were going to have to slow down, Andrew and Ben start to slow, but they can see that Tony is not slowing down. Tony loses control of his car, and he hits a utility pole that is about that big around. And so Andrew and Ben see this. They get out of their car. They go to where Tony is. They look in. They see him moving, so they think that Tony is still alive, but they can't get in the car because the doors are so jammed in from the impact of the crash. Well, they called 911, and then Ben calls us, and then they call the parents of Tony. And I will never forget the grief of our friends Jerry and Joanna when their son was so tragically killed. But through their grief, when they had the funeral a few days later, they insisted that our pastor have an altar call. I've never seen that happen at a funeral, but they did not want Tony's death to be to go without a reason, for there not to be a cause. There were many, many young people at Tony's funeral, and when young kids die, many of their friends show up because they can't believe. I worked in a high school in fact, I retired just a couple months ago from a high school, and I know that kids feel like they're invincible. They feel like harm will never come to them. And so when it does, they are very stricken. They're very grief-stricken. And that altar call served to prick the conscience of some of those friends of Tony who otherwise may never have heard the word, never have heard that. Lastly, there is one ultimate example of good coming out of evil, and that is the story of Jesus Christ and how he suffered so much for us through betrayals, through physical suffering, and in all ways to such a degree that he asked his Father, "Are you sure this is what you want me to do? If this is your will, I'll do it. But are you sure that this is what you want me to do?" And suffered to the degree that his sweat, they say, was like blood. It was just so severe. But through that sacrifice, we now have a way to heaven. And that's the ultimate glory for us as a Christian. And so in closing, I will share something with you from Sandy Patty, who is a Christian artist who's been around for many, many years. And she said this: "Only God can turn a mess into a message. Only God can turn a test into a testimony. Only God can turn a trial into a triumph. And only God can turn a victim into a victory." And so as we go through the next few minutes and we're looking at these questions, I know that there are so many more examples of good from evil and what is our responsibility when we go through hard times. And so we were going to give you an opportunity to share some of those. So I thank you again for allowing us to speak to you, and I think that we are getting those questions now to share with you.